So, political commentator Glenn Beck has delivered a really urgent message, and what's interesting is he says it's not a political one. He's framing America's entire crisis right now as a medical emergency. We're talking a life-or-death diagnosis for the whole nation.
And he really boils this incredibly complex situation down to just this one simple but pretty profound question. It's a question he believes every single American has to answer for themselves right now.
So, to really get what he's saying, we've got to unpack this powerful medical analogy he's using. It's the key to his entire argument about America's future. So let's break it down.
Okay, so Beck starts off by presenting a diagnosis. He argues that for decades now, America has been showing all these symptoms of a disease that's either been misdiagnosed or, even worse, just completely ignored.
And there it is. That's the core of his entire thesis. He's extremely careful to clarify he's not talking about a religion. He's talking about a very specific political ideology that he believes functions exactly like a malignant cancer inside of Western civilization.
And Beck is very, very specific about this definition. He identifies what he calls Islamism as the revolutionary apocalyptic ideology of the Iranian regime. So that specific ideology, that's the cancer his entire analogy is built on.
And this is where the analogy gets really detailed. Just look at how he maps out the traits. On one side, you've got cancer. He says it feeds on a healthy body. Well, he argues this ideology feeds on stable nations. Cancer spreads if you don't treat it. He claims this ideology spreads through groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. And maybe most importantly, just like a tumor doesn't care if you deny it's there, in fact it thrives, he says this ideology thrives while we just sit around and debate whether it even exists.
But according to Beck, this isn't some new diagnosis. He's saying it's a diagnosis that was made almost half a century ago, but it was just met with denial and delay over and over again.
This timeline really lays out his whole historical argument. He says the diagnosis came way back in 1979 with the Iran hostage crisis. Then what followed were decades of what he calls delayed treatment, things like diplomacy and sanctions. And all of that brings us to today, the crisis point. This is where he believes the disease just can't be contained anymore.
So Beck's argument is that all this inaction basically created the perfect petri dish for the cancer to metastasize. It spread while politicians were busy debating whose fault it was. It fed on all the reassurances that, oh, everything's normal. And slowly but surely, in his words, it infected everything from universities to our own neighborhoods.
Now, because the so-called cancer was ignored for so long, Beck says the time for simple solutions is way past. The only options left on the table are radical, painful, and frankly invasive.
All right, here's the big shift in his analogy. The patient, America, waited too long. Polite diplomacy, sanctions, in his view, all of that has failed. So now the treatment can't be a simple procedure. It has to be the equivalent of chemotherapy, a brutal, systemic process designed to purge the body from the inside out.
And then he maps the awful side effects of chemo directly onto what's happening today. Hair loss and sickness during treatment, he says that's like the ongoing terror attacks. That physical weakness a patient feels, he compares that to our depleted armed forces. And that feeling of actually being worse during the treatment than before, he points right at internal division and protests. So in his view, the chaos we see today isn't a sign of failure, it's the unavoidable, painful side effect of the only treatment that can save the patient.
And he gets ahead of the obvious counterargument with this quote. To anyone who says, you know what, we were better off before all this started, his response is basically, yeah, the patient felt better, but they were dying. The treatment feels awful, but he argues it's the only path to actually surviving.
So this all leads to Beck's ultimate point. The patient is on the operating table. The surgery has already started. And now a choice, a huge choice, has to be made.
From Beck's perspective, the time for talking and debating is over. The surgery has begun. It doesn't really matter anymore if you were for it or against it. The first cut has been made. The only question now is, how do we finish the operation?
And he presents two very stark surgical choices. Option 1, get the margins. And that's a real surgical turn. It means aggressively cutting out every single last cancerous cell, no matter how painful it is. Because if you leave even one cell behind, the disease just comes roaring back, maybe even stronger. Option 2, stop the procedure. Just sew the body up, admit the cancer is too far gone, and let the patient die.
But in the end, Beck doesn't actually give an answer. He just leaves the whole nation with a question. Looking at this patient on the table, he asks, is it worth saving, even if it means going through the incredible pain of this radical treatment? And that's the question that just hangs in the air, challenging everyone to decide for themselves.